So this is a paper that comes out of one of the aims of Work Package 4, where we were asked to use existing data to consider support for democracy across different socio-demographic groups. We have taken this and stolen it a little bit and focused on a very particular and minoritarian social group, namely Muslims in Western Europe. This is work co-authored with Elena Kosu and Louis Settelmeyer, now EUI and in Paris. So we basically focus on how diversity and democracy work together and begin from the premise that most of us hold, and that suggests that diversity and democracy don't mix very well, right? Democracy is supposed to be based on some, at least somewhat homogeneous populace that will agree on a number of premises. Main expectations in the literature concerning ethnic minorities or these particular minorities is that heterogeneity challenges democracy, it undermines the possibility to agree and to have effective public policy. And secondly, there is a lot of understanding that minorities are conservative and parochial communitarians who focus on their own group. And now we challenge this argument, partly stemming from the work that I have done previously, and we basically try to suggest that minorities might actually have core stakes in limiting majorities, which potentially leads them to propose or at least support some core liberal democratic principles. And so we suggest that under a set of conditions, minorities could be conditionally supportive of democracy, but that this support of democracy will be traded off as a function of various confounders, particularly religiosity and cultural conservatism that will moderate this. So we focus on Muslims in Western Europe because this is a particularly interesting minority group of the population. It is perhaps the most significant outgroup in Western Europe. There is much rhetoric about Islam, generally against Islam, to the extent that we include it in our expert surveys and we include it in our analyses of political texts. While it's a relatively small population of about 5% of the EU, in some areas and in some countries it is becoming increasingly significant, France being the largest Muslim population in Western Europe with 8% of the population. Frequently portrayed as opposed to Western values, we therefore think that they make a critical test of whether there is such a thing as minority support for democracy. So the theory that we put forward largely relies on previous work that I have done and basically suggests that ethnicity and ethnic minority status are a powerful human characteristic that influences the way we perceive ourselves with respect to others and with respect to the state. It is of course constructed, it's flexible, porous, and differentially activated, but very often ethnicity is rooted in innate and early socialized characteristics such as phenotype, language, religion, or culture. While of course you can change your religion, it is not always that easy. Now, minorities generally face two predicaments. They are in a particular dual minority situation. On the one hand, they tend to hold systematically distinct interests from the majority, and those interests are particularly their own self-preservation and the preservation of the particular characteristics that differentiate them from the majority population, such as the freedom to practice their religion, ability to speak their language, etc. And secondly, they are minorities in the political sense. They can be systematically outvoted by the majority and their interests can therefore be ignored. And so consequently, we would expect minorities to seek the limit of the tyranny of the majority, broadly speaking. And liberal democracy provides one, but generally widely accepted, or at least used to be widely accepted, way of constraining the majority. So we would expect minorities to champion, conditionally, but nonetheless champion counter-majoritarian aspects of democracy. This is, of course, conditional. There are a number of conditions that I set up in my general argument and on why and when minorities will be cross-pressured in their search for democracy, and religiosity and cultural conservatism are two of the key sources of attenuating pressure for democracy. Right? This is because religion and cultural conservatism tend to be hierarchical, exclusive, tend to believe in absolute truth, and also tend to undermine the ability to compromise. So we put forward two general hypotheses: that Muslims in Western Europe will be more likely to support liberal democracy than majorities, and secondly, that religiosity and cultural conservatism will attenuate this positive effect of being a Muslim and supporting democracy. Now, data. Data is a huge issue for the very simple reason that we don't really have very good data that would properly sample Muslim populations in Western Europe. We're not really able to overcome this problem, but we do try to demonstrate that there are better data and worse data out there, and that we are using the better data that is available. We are using ESS data, which generally, of course, is a poor choice to study any minorities of any kind, and this particular Muslim minority generally, simply because it is not designed to do that. However, we compare this data to other sources. I'm sorry, this is relatively small, but we compare this to a very explicitly Muslim-focused data set called Eurislam, and we benchmark this against the French TEO, which is a particular data set that was developed in order to measure Muslim and migrant minorities, or generally foreign and migrant minorities in France. And we demonstrate here that the ESS is far better in representing the Muslim population in France than the Eurislam data set. Let me just point out how tertiary education is hugely overrepresented in the Eurislam sample, or for example that there are literally 7 Algerians in the Eurislam sample for France, while there are very many Turks and, interestingly, very many Pakistanis. If you know anything about France, you should immediately conclude that Eurislam data is absolutely wrong. So while the data is poor, the ESS data is better than anything that we have access to. Now, how do we design this measure? We use the standard measure of democracy developed by Hans-Peter Krisi and others who have designed this segment of the ESS data, with one important exception. We exclude the minority rights component of it. Not because we don't think it's a part of democracy, but because we think, or in fact we've been criticized for loading our data because, yes, minorities generally like minority rights. So we look at all the other components about fair elections, judicial independence, etc., but we remove minority rights. We measure cultural conservatism as a combination of views on a number of cultural issues, and here I go using that term again. We also use an original French survey where we have a question about support for strong leader to hopefully give further credit to our findings. All right, what are our results? I will show them graphically. This graph demonstrates the marginal effect of being a Muslim on the support for democracy. So you should read this as the beta coefficient on the dummy variable of identifying as being Muslim on your support for democracy. And this is as religiosity changes from low to maximum. And what you can see is that at low levels of religiosity, those people who identify as Muslims are significantly more supportive of democracy than those who don't, so all others. And as religiosity increases, this effect becomes statistically insignificant, but never does it become negative and significant. So from this we can conclude that secular Muslims are more supportive of democracy than secular non-Muslims, but highly religious Muslims are not less supportive of democracy than highly religious others. The same effect comes up if we consider this as a function or as modified by cultural conservatism. Liberal Muslims are significantly more supportive of democracy than liberal others, and as conservatism increases, this effect simply becomes statistically insignificant. So broadly speaking, Muslims are either more supportive of democracy, or if they're religious or culturally conservative, they become the same as the majority. This is very much opposed to pretty much everything that has been written or that is being thought of Muslims in Western Europe. To add to this, we look at this particular survey that Philippe Kostelka and I have run in France, where we identify people as belonging to diverse religions. So we have people who say they don't have any religion, those who are Catholics and those who are Muslims. This is roughly 90% or 95% of the data. And we look at support for a strong leader, which we generally consider to be one of the key aspects of authoritarianism, across their levels of religiosity. What is interesting is that those people who have no religion, some of them, very few of them, report to be very religious, that is, go to religious services. I suppose they're there for the cakes. Don't exactly know how that works. But anyway, the point is that these people generally support strong leaders significantly more than Muslims across all levels of religiosity. Among Catholics, this level is also significantly higher than those of Muslims in France. So again, this overall demonstrates that in France, religious Muslims or secular Muslims are generally less supportive of a strong leader, because guess who that strong leader would be and what she would think about Muslims. We do some more sophisticated methods where we actually cross-cut cultural conservatism and religiosity. To our surprise, they're actually not as highly correlated as we thought, and they're actually less correlated among Muslims than among non-Muslims. This demonstrates that everywhere, Muslims are more supportive of democracy than non-Muslims, and it's particularly statistically significant in the areas of lower cultural conservatism and lower religiosity. We also do this tree that shows that it's effectively cultural conservatism that is more determinant of support for democracy, and religiosity comes second. All right, let me conclude. I have a number of thoughts in conclusion. I mean, one fundamental thing is that it really seems that support for democracy is socially rooted in one's relationship to the polity and the particular insecurity that one feels with regard to the majority that necessarily controls that polity. There is also a more general conclusion. When we presented this paper at a major conference, one of the discussants said, you know, who are these liberal Muslims? And I was struck by that question. Fortunately, one of our previous students of Moroccan origin was there, and he was able to raise his hand and say, I am. The idea that Muslims are a very heterogeneous group, and that this heterogeneous group behaves also as a function of other particular social characteristics, is important for us to realize. What I would like to finish on is the idea that ethnic minority precarity does not reduce, but generally augments support for democracy, because these minorities, under the set of conditions that we suggest, are more likely to support democracy in order to support their self-preservation. Support for democracy is higher if Muslims are secular or liberal, or the same if they are religious and conservative as the majority. So on the whole, Muslims and minorities may actually be an asset for democracy. Ethnic liberalism may therefore apply not just to some particular historical cases that I've studied in the past, but may also apply to these more diffuse migrant origin minorities that we find in Western Europe and, of course, across the entire world. Now, a word of caution, this data is not ideal. If anyone has €500,000 that I could use to run a proper survey that samples Muslims correctly, I will take them after the presentation. Obviously, we could not carry subgroup analyses that we would like to carry. I am sure that there are certain groups, I would imagine particularly younger, uneducated men of the third generation, who will be fundamentally anti-democratic. But that does not erase the general lesson that these minorities are overall more likely to support democracy than majorities. In conclusion, Democrats across the board should consider the way that they could utilize this and should reach out to cooperate with moderate Muslims. Thank you.